Welcome to Collars Calluses, a working theology for young men, where grit meets grace and faith meets the workbench, where young men can come to learn how to grow in the strength, wisdom, and courage that God calls them to. In a world confused about manhood, we open God's Word and roll up our sleeves. We'll talk theology that's not just for the classroom, but for the job site, the gym, the family table, and the front lines of life. We are about forging biblical masculinity that works in the real world for real men to the glory of God. This is Collars and Calluses. Let's get to work. Welcome to another episode of Collars and Calluses. Rich and I are here with you again, and we're glad that you're here with us and listening to this podcast, and pray that it has been an encouragement to you. And today we want to get into, we have been covering really a lot of themes in Proverbs, because Proverbs is written to and for young men. It is Solomon giving instruction to his son, his soon to be king, this prince, about what it means to rule and how he is supposed to take dominion in the world. So we've been dealing with that in a lot of different themes. And you can see, if you go through the catalog of our podcast, you can see those things. And we want to begin focusing now on the subject of wealth. There's a lot in Proverbs about wealth. And now, granted, there are a lot of gospel, quote unquote, preachers out there that have distorted a lot of the biblical teaching, excuse me, on wealth. And we would call those prosperity gospel preachers, these televangelists. And I don't know just how popular they are today. I mean, it's more popular now to talk about these political issues and Israel and all these things. And I don't know how much young men are getting into the prosperity gospel today, but they're out there. There are these hucksters who are trying to get you to plant your seed of faith and send them money so that you can prosper. And lots of times these prosperity gospel preachers were big a couple of decades ago. And one of the things that they did, though, was they really turned people off. These guys were preaching prosperity gospel. They were preaching about wealth and all this. And it seems as if that there was this kind of reaction against that, and that Christians really shouldn't be working for wealth, and they shouldn't have wealth. And we really probably ought to be like St. Francis of Assisi or somebody like that and take vows of poverty and things like that. But the Bible is very clear on some issues about wealth, and we want to talk about those and about actually the goodness of wealth, but also wealth dangers and the different types of wealth that we have. Now, Proverbs at the beginning.
Phil, if I can jump in there.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
With a few thoughts on what you said. I think you're right. I think the prosperity gospel, with the televangelists, it was usually, if you send me money, God will prosper you, that was interesting. I don't think that's as popular as it used to be. But I think the mentality that drove the prosperity gospel is still around. The idea that if I do X, Y, and Z, then God's obligated to prosper me and give me a successful and happy and maybe even easy life. And that's clearly not the teaching of the Bible. But I think in reaction to that, what you really had is what I would call the poverty gospel, you were getting at this with St. Francis of Assisi, where the idea was it's more godly to be poor.
Right.
It's more godly to be a missionary on a low income than to be a CEO of a bank or something like that. And I didn't come up with this scheme, this paradigm, but I think it's a good way to think about it. The prosperity gospel is flawed in that it sees wealth as the automatic result of doing something godly, which may or may not happen. You can be godly and still be in poverty. The poverty gospel saw godliness as consisting in being impoverished, and you're automatically suspicious of people who have wealth. They must have gotten it by in some kind of illegitimate way. And so therefore the rich are actually evil, and you demonize success, you demonize the wealthy. So you've got the prosperity gospel that equates wealth with godliness. You've got the poverty gospel that equates poverty with godliness. I would say the biblical way of looking at this is what you might call the productivity gospel, which is to say what God calls us to is a life of fruitfulness, a life of productivity. And in many cases, that will mean accumulating wealth, and that's actually a good thing. Um, it's not going to always result in wealth. If you live in a very oppressive political and economic system, it may not matter how hard you work or how faithful you are. There are going to be hard limits on how much wealth you can accumulate. But what I've said is the kind of nation you want to live in is one where the book of Proverbs can come true.
Right.
So where hard work is rewarded, where foolishness is punished, but where what you want to do is live a productive, fruitful life. I've summarized Proverbs teaching on wealth this way, and this may give us kind of a framework for the whole discussion. Because wealth is good, we should be grateful for it. Not guilty over it, but grateful for it.
Right.
Because wealth is good, we should be grateful for it. Because wealth is dangerous, we should be generous with it. And because wealth is powerful, we should garner. We should seek to gather it.
Yeah.
We should garner as much of it as possible lawfully. And that's actually something that's taught in our Westminster Shorter Catechism, which what is required by the eighth commandment is not just what's forbidden is taking what is not yours from another. So there's obviously the eighth commandment presupposes private property, but the eighth commandment also requires us to lawfully procure and further the wealth and outward estate of ourselves and others. There's a whole philosophy of economics bound up in what the catechism is teaching there. We are required to pursue wealth, the lawful procuring of wealth for ourselves and others. So even before Adam Smith, the Westminster Divines are recognizing economic is not a zero-sum game. Your success, your prosperity does not necessitate someone else's poverty. A rising tide can lift all boats, that kind of thing. So that's kind of a basic framework here for our discussion.
Yeah, yeah, and what you were mentioning there, we'll get into more of this, but before I forget, because my forgetter works pretty good, is that there is this idea in the world. A lot of people believe this, that the world has a certain amount of wealth, and you divide it up into these equal segments or these unequal segments, and there's no getting outside of that pie. And then some are going to have more, and if some have more, then others are going to have less. And that's just the way that it works.
That is how socialists and Marxists think of economics in those terms, where the pie is only so big. And so your piece of the pie always comes at someone else's expense. That's not a biblical view of wealth. We confess that the Holy Spirit is the Lord and giver of life. And because the Holy Spirit is infinite, we can go on and on creating more and more wealth so the pie can get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Exactly.
And of course, in free societies where the law of God, where you've got a society that's seeking to conform to the law of God, that is exactly what you see. Yeah. God has built, I won't say limitless, but almost limitless potential into his creation. And when man mixes his labor with those resources that God has built into his world, that's where you get wealth.
Right. The world is fruitful, is a fruitful place.
Exactly.
God's made it that way. He sustains it that way.
Wise human labor plus creational resources equals wealth.
Yes, exactly. And so wealth is something that God wants us to have, as Rich was mentioning there. In fact, in the beginning of Proverbs chapter 3, Solomon tells his son, honor Yahweh or honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase. So your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. We're going to get into what he means by honoring the Lord with your possessions. But the basic idea there is that God wants your barns to be filled with plenty. He wants your vats to overflow with new wine. He wants you to be fruitful because that is our mission. Our mission is to make the world a fruitful place. But one of the things, going back to the prosperity gospel, so-called, when we hear something like that, it sounds like God is promising that the wise will undoubtedly prosper. If you do this, it goes back to what Rich was saying. For instance, honoring the Lord, and we'll get to this, but it really has to do with your tithe, and honoring the Lord with your possessions. So if I tithe, or if I give money to the church, then I'm going to get all this back. It's just this is the way it's going to work. And it sounds like God is promising that we will undoubtedly have full barns and full wine vats. And all that needs to actually be taken into a larger context. And it includes the accumulation of material possessions, but it is not exclusive to the accumulation of material possessions. And neither is it short-sighted. One of the things I'm going to bring out as we discuss this, I don't think Solomon is short-sighted in Proverbs. I know that there's an approach to Proverbs that says, well, these are generalities and this is the way things normally work. And I understand the perspective on that, that and as Rich was bringing out just a little bit earlier, there are lots of things that depend. You want to live in a country where Proverbs actually can be realized. But if I'm living in North Korea and I'm applying this wisdom, that doesn't, I'm probably not going to be as wealthy. Um, I'm not going to be as wealthy as what we hear these prosperity gospel preachers preaching, or what we may think that the scripture is saying. But Solomon doesn't have, I don't believe, a short-sighted vision. Now, in the world, these things generally work. If I plant one seed in the ground, I can get 30, 60, 100 fold from that one seed. That's generally how things work in the world. But there are lots of conditions that must be right for that to work. But I think that Solomon also has what we would call an eschatological vision with these proverbs, that he's playing the long game, and he's talking about eternal wealth just as much as he is temporal wealth. And so these things ultimately do come true for the believer, because we are the ones who will inherit the world. And it's the wise, it's the righteous who will inherit the world. And so we're trying to keep everything in a biblical context here. So just stay with us as we go through this. Now, as was mentioned, wealth is the fruit of dominion. Now, wealth comes in a lot of different forms, and I don't want to downplay material possessions, and we'll talk a lot about those, I'm sure. But I want you to understand that wealth comes in many different forms. And where we find it in Proverbs, we find it in Psalms. Psalm 127 says that children are a heritage of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is his reward. Children are wealth. Children are wealth. Wealth can come in the form also of peace. Proverbs 15:17 says, better is dinner of herbs where love is than a fattened ox, and hatred with it. Peace is the fruit of wisdom and dominion's project. And so it is better to have just a very, very few possessions in peace than it is to have great possessions and strife. And so there's a wealth in having peace. Wisdom itself is considered wealth in Proverbs. Proverbs 3:13-14 says, blessed is the one who finds wisdom, and the one who gets understanding, for the gain from her is better than gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. And so wisdom itself, a wise man may be poor, but he is a very wealthy man. So wisdom can be measured, wealth can be measured in many different ways. Wealth is also what is treasured up for eternity. Riches that moth and rust do not corrupt, and thieves do not break through and steal, as Jesus talked about. So again, Solomon, I don't think is short-sighted. I think he has an eternal perspective on what wealth is. The righteous will be wealthy, principally, and every one of us will be wealthy in the life to come. Now, that doesn't disparage any accumulation of abundance of possessions in this life. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying, well, we just live for the future so we don't worry about building wealth for the present. It's a both and we need to understand it that way. Rich, do you have any thoughts on the different forms of wealth?
Yeah, that's very good. Wealth does come in a variety of forms, and that needs to be recognized. So wealth is not identical to money. Money is one particular form of wealth, but wealth is a much broader category in the Bible. So again, you've got things like wisdom is considered a form of wealth. Children, again, Psalm 127. You can think about this societally. We inherit wealth in the form of traditions and customs and a whole way of life that is handed down to us. And that's a form of wealth that in many ways we have squandered in recent generations. So you can think of Western civilization as a kind of civilizational wealth that we've largely squandered. And we're trying to preserve what's been best about Western civilization, Western Christendom. So, yeah, we need to think about wealth in a variety of ways, not just in terms of how much money do you have.
However,
Even when we talk about really wealthy people, most of their wealth is not held in cash. Most of it is tied up in other kinds of assets.
right.
But again, one thing that can't be measured, say, by the GDP or some other economic metric is wealth in the form of children, wealth in the form of happiness, wealth in the form of a peaceful household, wealth in the form of friendships and customs and whole way of life that gives life meaning and significance and joy.
Right. Yeah. Now, getting to material wealth, possessions and lands and things like that. Um, I I don't think at all Solomon is disparaging any type of wealth in the present life. I don't think the Bible disparages any type of wealth in the present life. I think, in fact, it is part of our mission. And when we are given the opportunity, when we're given the freedom, say in a governmental system or in our society, to work and be productive, wealth is the expectation that God has for His people. Because if He provides us the context in which to work and freedom to exercise the gifts that He's given to us, then He expects us to be productive with what He's given to us. Now, again, if He's put us in a place in a communist country where we're oppressed, everything's going to look different. But if He's given us freedom to do things, then He expects us to be fruitful in that. And now, even though, as I said, wealth can be measured in other ways, money and possessions are indeed one form of wealth. When we look at biblical characters such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were all rich. They were all very wealthy men. When God prescribes the building of the tabernacle and the temples, those were ornate buildings and they were filled with all sorts of treasures, gold and silver and brass, all the best types of wood and unique arts. All these things were in the tabernacle and temple, which was God's palace. And so God is not against us having wealth and developing wealth. In Genesis chapter 2, we find out from the very beginning where the rivers flow through Eden and through the garden and down, and they split into four. And there are precious metals and stones downstream from the garden. And those things were to be collected and shaped to become a part of the temple. We learn that they indeed are in 1 Chronicles 29. So God expects us to go and dig out the potential of the world and then shape it into a house that is fit for Him, which is our mission in the world. Now, as Rich mentioned earlier, wealth is dangerous, but it's the love of riches that is really the danger. Paul talks about that in First Timothy chapter 6. But riches are in themselves aren't evil. And that's one of the things that we need to make sure we understand. You working to be fruitful, you working for wealth, you working for money to support your family and even provide them comforts is not evil in itself. God's reward for a life wisely lived is the crown of wealth to increase your glory, dominion, responsibility, authority, and splendor. Now, the reason God does this is because the wise are executing His plan for the world. And so He gives the riches of the wise, all of their influence, power, and authority are used to bring the peace and fruitfulness God intends. So God increases your wealth so that you have more power, so that you have more influence, so that you have more authority in the world to advance His kingdom in the world. So God wants us to do more of what we're supposed to be doing. So when we show ourselves responsible, when we show ourselves worthy of receiving more authority, He increases our wealth so that we might be able to have that power to do those things. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who's wealthy is righteous. I mean, it's very obvious in Scripture that you can accumulate an abundance of things even if you're wicked. The wicked can earn wages through deceit, Proverbs 11:18 says. His house may be torn down in the future, but he does have a house to be destroyed. He's built something, therefore he has he has some measure of wealth, but he's built his house on sand and not on the rock. So their wealth is going to fade. And that's why God tells us not to envy the wicked. He says, fret not yourself because of evildoers, and be not envious of the wicked, for the evil man has no future. The lamp of the wicked will be put out. So again, Proverbs isn't promising too much because Solomon has that long game in mind. He has the big picture in mind. And so as we work for wealth, we need to understand the purpose of it. We get it because we have been faithful in our dominion. That's how we're supposed to accumulate it. But then when we have it, we need to understand how to use it. Rich, do you have any thoughts on how to use wealth?
Yeah, well, let me talk about the source of wealth here for just another minute,
Okay.
because and we come back to the use in just a second. So it's important to understand there are four categories of people, you could say. There's the righteous and unrighteous rich, and there's the righteous and unrighteous poor. So being rich doesn't automatically mean you're righteous or unrighteous. Being poor doesn't mean you're automatically righteous or unrighteous. There are four categories: the righteous and unrighteous rich, the righteous and unrighteous poor. It's really important, I think, especially in today's world, where we have carved out such a prosperous and, relative to history, easy way of life compared to what our ancestors lived. It's easy for us to take a lot of things for granted. Wealth is both the product of dominion and a form of dominion. So let me give you an example here. And this, you may be able to say something similar about Carbondale. So I live in Birmingham, Alabama. If you rewind, say, 200 years, go back 200 years, the state of Alabama is a new state admitted to the Union in 1819. There's really hardly anything in what is present day Birmingham. Birmingham was actually founded as a city in 1871. And essentially, the reason it was founded is that people found iron in the ground here. And in fact, they found everything that you need to turn iron into steel right in this area. And so we became a steel city. Eventually, we became known as the Pittsburgh of the South, which, can there be any better way to be known than that? I like to think of Pittsburgh as the Birmingham of the North, but and I think Birmingham even got its name after the English city of Birmingham, which was also a steel town. But think about this: they found iron in the ground. Well, what iron in the ground is worthless. That's not wealth in and of itself. It had always been there, and nobody saw it as wealth. But once man developed a way to transform iron into steel, it becomes a form of wealth. And so what did people do? They worked to dig it out of the ground. They built a city around this industry. In fact, Birmingham's nickname is actually the Magic City, which it got its nickname, the Magic City, because the city grew so rapidly, mostly with immigrants coming to work in the steel industry. The city grew so rapidly from the 1880s to the 1920s that it was like magic. It was growing so fast. But obviously, to grow the city that rapidly took a lot of work. Digging iron ore out of the ground and turning it into steel is not an easy process. And then you've got to build railways. You got to build railroads in order to transport that steel to wherever it needs to go. Laying down railroad tracks, not easy work. So today, of course, Birmingham we don't have much of a steel industry left. Most of that's been offshored. We got a lot of other industries like banking and telecom and medical care and various forms of manufacturing, that kind of thing. In fact, I'm proud to say Alabama is one of the very few states left where our main industry is manufacturing. We actually still make stuff here, which I'm grateful for. But all of that takes work. Okay. Yeah. Same kind of thing with oil. Oil was something that just got in the way when you were trying to dig a well for a long period of history. And then man found uses for it. They found that they could use this oil as a form of energy. And all of a sudden it becomes very valuable. So it's human ingenuity, it's human labor, transforming the resources that got the potentiality that God built into his creation. That's what generates wealth. So wealth is a form of dominion. Now, once you accumulate wealth, that also means that you have dominion. And so now what are you going to do with that wealth? And that goes back to what I started in terms of the framework of Proverbs. Wealth is good, so be grateful for it. Wealth is dangerous, so be generous with it. And wealth is a form of power, so garner it. Garner as much of it as possible. Yeah. Okay. And we can get into generosity more later and what some of these things mean. But I think that's the fundamental way. I think today there's a real tendency, and again, this is sort of the poverty gospel taking root, where people think that um, it's actually a bad thing to have wealth, especially on the political left. You see this where they demonize that we shouldn't have any billionaires. We're going to demonize rich people, demonize the really successful people. I actually preached a sermon, wrote an essay one time called "Why We Need More Christian Billionaires," because we really do. We
Yes,
have more Christians who attain that level of dominion and can use their money for good purposes. That would be a beautiful and wonderful thing for that to happen.
I would sign up for that.
Building a civilization is not cheap. Building a civilization founded on truth, beauty, and goodness is not cheap. Being a patron for the arts. How do you get beautiful art in a civilization? Well, you have to have enough money to have patrons who can actually support the artist, because the artist can't be totally held captive to market forces. That's just not the way you get great art, generally speaking. So artists need patrons. Well, that requires wealth. So, and of course, then you've got Christian institutions, obviously tithing to your church, but then also doing things like building beautiful church buildings, starting Christian schools and universities, Christian hospitals, all these different things. They're all ways in which we can use wealth as a form of power for good, to build the kind of civilization that God calls us to build. So those are all things that I think we need to keep in mind. My dad used to tell me growing up, he said, "You'll never work for a poor person."
Right.
Don't demonize the rich, because that's who you're always going to be working for.
That's exactly right. One of the things you were talking about, wealth does give us that leisure in society that allows us to have arts and things as such like that. Because if I'm working every day just to put bread on the table, my daily bread, so to speak, if I'm farming, if I'm doing all these things myself, and I don't have that wealth, then we don't have any leisure time to do the arts. We don't have any leisure time to do the studying. We don't have all those things. So wealth does provide us a great opportunity to have all the beauties of life and the things I think that make life even more worth living, so to speak.
And those things should be enjoyed. That's another note that you get in Proverbs, and maybe especially in Ecclesiastes. We are commanded to enjoy God's gifts.
Yes.
We are to see these various forms of wealth as gifts from God. So we should be grateful for them, and we should enjoy them. And this is you should enjoy them guilt-free. So important to stress that. Again, everywhere Jesus went, he threw a party. There's always eating and drinking when Jesus is around. So much that they falsely, but they still accused him of being a drunkard and a glutton, because he's eating and drinking everywhere he goes. So if you have enough money to have nice clothes, we're both wearing decent clothes, collared shirts, enjoy that. Enjoy that shirt you're wearing. You got a decent house with just a thought that you'd have a bedroom of your own, or only have to share a bedroom with one other person when you're growing up, or something like that. Enjoy that. You've got a car to drive. Give thanks for that. Enjoy it. You've got the money to go out to eat every now and then, or take a vacation every now and then. Enjoy that. And I would say to the super wealthy person, you got enough money to have a Lamborghini and a yacht. Enjoy that. I don't begrudge you for that. Assuming that your wealth was lawfully gained, I don't begrudge you for that at all. Enjoy that. I don't and never will have that kind of wealth, but that's fine. We don't have to be at the same level. I'll enjoy the gifts God's given me. You enjoy the gifts God's given you. Enjoy those things. Now, the key to enjoying them, of course, is giving thanks for them.
Right.
If you're not grateful, you can't enjoy. So gratitude and joy go together. The gratitude for the gift and the enjoyment of the gift are inseparably linked. It's kind of like you have a bottle of wine, of really wonderful wine, but if you don't have a bottle opener, you can't enjoy it. Okay, well, the bottle opener is gratitude. That's what opens up the bottle so it can flow, so you can enjoy it. Okay, but you really should enjoy those things guilt-free. We also live in a culture, and again, progressivism has done this to us, where we are made to feel guilty for any kind of privilege that we have. Again, privileges that you may have grown up with or that you may enjoy in your life right now, those privileges are not there for you to feel guilty about. You don't have to grovel because you have certain privileges. It is not a sin to have been born an American. And we know being born in America is a privilege, historically speaking, but even in the world today, it's a privilege. So don't feel guilty about that. Give thanks for it. It's not a sin to have had parents who loved you and disciplined you and read to you and educated you growing up. That's something to be grateful for. It's not a sin to have abundant possessions. Again, that's something you should be grateful for. It's not a sin to be able to eat 3 square meals a day. Again, that's something to be grateful for. So the left, especially in our day, because they don't understand the creation mandate, they don't understand stewardship, they don't understand wealth, and because they want to engage in class warfare and race warfare and sexual identity politics and all these kind of things, they want to make you feel guilty for any kind of privilege you have. And you should not. You should be grateful for the privileges that God has granted to you, grateful for the gifts he has given to you.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll talk about how you build on those later. But yeah, these things are given to you as gifts to be thankful for and for you to then take up and use to build God's kingdom. And one of the things that Solomon emphasizes is wealth's foundation begins with honoring the Lord. So to be truly wealthy, you need to honor the Lord. He says, honor Yahweh, honor the Lord with your wealth and the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. Now, it may seem like an odd thing to talk about with young men, but I think it needs to be addressed because it's obviously addressed in Proverbs, is that what does it mean to honor the Lord with your possessions? Uh, you're not just out here, you're not just an atheistic capitalist. You're not Ayn Rand, laissez-faire capitalism out there just trying to earn a buck. You're one of the producers and that type of thing. You need to understand the foundation of wealth, where it comes from, and how to handle that in your life. Now, the beginning of wealth is honoring the Lord. Now, honor is not limited to your attitude. Now, we are to give due reverence to God as far as our attitude goes and our speech and everything else. But when Solomon talks about that here, and when we even hear it in the fifth commandment to be honoring our father and mother, Jesus speaks about that in Matthew 15 as providing support for your father and your mother. Honor can be a money issue. Double honor in 1 Timothy 5:17 talks about money. Those who teach, those who preach the gospel, those who labor diligently in teaching, they should be given double honor. In Proverbs 3:9-10, it speaks of honoring with possession as an act of worship. And that goes to giving. That goes to tithing. Now, there are some questions about tithing, and I think we can address these. This gets into some issues, I think, as pastors. Sometimes some pastors are very cautious about dealing with tithing because it looks like we're just trying to feather our own beds. I did see a video the other day of a pastor who said he was going to start taking up the tax returns of his congregation because he knows that he knows that they're not living on what they're tithing. But so we're not going to go that far.
Henry North's proposal was that you had to basically swear that you were tithing in order to be a voting member of the congregation. So kind of using that, if you're not vested in this institution enough, then you don't get to have a say in what happens here. So you have to be a tither. We haven't implemented that at my church, but I always thought that was an interesting concept. It's interesting because today you will have people say, well, there was actually a kind of logic and wisdom going back in history before we went towards more universal suffrage that only property owners voted because they were the ones who had a stake in things. And if you're not a property owner, you can just vote that you can vote for the government to redistribute that property to you, which that's something that we've been susceptible to in America with the widening of suffrage, where you end up with this redistribution of resources from the productive to the unproductive. So there's a logic to those kind of things. The Bible doesn't spell all those things out for us. It's the kind of thing I think it does command tithing, but I think the voting and that kind of thing, those are things that are largely left to our judgment and our prudence, but interesting to think those things through.
Yeah, absolutely. And young men, if you don't know what suffrage is, go look it up on Grok or whatever. So we'll just let you do that research on your own. The question, I think, and I think there are some theological questions that I think Rich and I can answer for you. One of the questions is, has tithing changed from the old covenant to the new covenant? I've run into a lot of people, and I used to have this kind of position myself when I was young, and that was, well, since the introduction of the new covenant, Paul talks about the fact that we're just basically to give whatever we want. And the tithe is not the baseline and should be more free will offering type things. give as God has prospered you, and that doesn't mean that doesn't set any amount. And tithing, though, is not something that began in with the law of Moses. Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek in Genesis 14. And so he obviously had some reason to pay a tithe to Melchizedek. Before that, that was already established. So he understood that because Melchizedek was a priest of the Most High God, and he came, and once he had defeated all the other armies and spoiled them, he brought and he paid the tithe. And so there's a principle there of tithing even before the law. Now, the question is, okay, what is a tithe? Tithe simply means 10%. It means 10%. Tithe is rooted in our stewardship of the world. That is, God has given us a stewardship. He owns the world. The earth belongs to the Lord and the fullness thereof. Psalm 24:1 says, and he has called us to be, and he's given us the responsibility to be stewards of the world, to care for it for him, and then to make it fruitful. And then as we do these things, we are to come and we're to bring a tenth of our increase. So, because that's what the king requires when we come for worship. Now, this is associated with what is called the tribute offering in Leviticus. Now, if you're going to turn up, and I know that you read Leviticus on a regular basis because you're young men and you're really interested in Leviticus, but if you go to read Leviticus, you're not going to see in translations the tribute offering. It's generally translated the grain offering or something like that. But this word in Hebrew is called it's minka. It really speaks about a tribute, and a tribute is something. It's something of a kingdom tax. It's a when a king takes over an area, you pay him tribute. You pay him this tax to live in his land, and God owns it all, and God owns everything that there is in the world. And he says, "There's a tribute. You pay it to me." We recognize in our tithe that we don't own anything, that God is the king, he owns everything, and we recognize his ownership. And so the tithe itself is a tangible expression of the fruitfulness of our mission. So we go out, we earn these things by God's grace, we make the world productive. And then God says, okay, when you come before me for worship, I want 10% of the increase. Now that's, by the way, that's 10% of what you actually made. Now, I'm not going to get off on a tangent, even though I could on things like estimated value of your property, which is I think an immoral tax. That's a property tax. It's not a tax on the increase. It's a tax on potential, and you never.
Well, it's a tax on wealth as opposed to a tax on your increase. The tithe is on your increase.
Yes, the tithe.
So whatever new income you have coming in, that's what you tithe off of. You don't
Yes.
tithe off, because if you were tithing off existing resources, I mean, for example, those resources could lose value.
Exactly. Exactly. So you're tithing off the increase. And the tithe is used to support the ministry of word and sacrament, Levitical ministry in the Old Covenant. By the way, and I was asked this not too long ago, whether or not I paid tithe, because it's like all the tithes come here, and then does the pastor pay tithe? Yes, I do believe pastors are supposed to pay tithe too, because when we receive income, it's an increase to us. Ministers gave a tithe as well. The Levitical, the Levites and the priests, they all gave tithes according to Numbers 18. So Paul assumes the continuity with this support in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Ministers who preach the gospel should live by the gospel, just as priests in the Old Covenant lived off what came in the altar, the tithe that came to the altar, all those things. And those things were used to support the ministry. They were used to support the poor. So the tithe was something that was required, and required by God's law. But I think it does continue. And I think Paul makes that very clear, that it does continue into the new covenant. Now, Rich, do we agree on that?
We do. Yeah. And I'm there with you. I think pastors should tithe. And I do think the tithe is an abiding command. The tithe was codified in the law, but it pre-existed the law. So Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. Then tithing is obviously a part of the Levitical system, the Mosaic order. And then I think you see references or allusions to it in the New Testament scriptures with no suggestion that it's been abrogated. Some people like to think, oh, well, the Old Testament had this tithing law, and now we just give as we feel led. And then, oddly enough, they feel led to give far less than the tithe. But if anything, you'd have to argue we should be more generous in the new covenant because God's given us more. We
Right.
should be more generous than the old covenant people were. But I think the tithe is still a baseline, and then above that is what you might call a free will offering.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to stress that the tithe is to the local church.
Yeah.
In Numbers chapter 18, the tithe is given specifically to the Levites because they are the ones who carry out the sanctuary ministry, because they are the ones from whom you receive the sacramental meal. And Paul draws an analogy between the way Levites were supported, Levitical priests were supported, and the way pastors are supported in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So I think that whole tithing requirement is still in force. I think that's something that God still wants his people to do. And I think God blesses tithing. And this is so if you haven't been tithing, like say you've been giving 3%, you realize, oh, I'm supposed to be giving 10%. I'd have to completely rearrange my whole budget. I would say, yes, you do. And I would say that as part of doing that, what you're going to find is you're probably, I mean, I've seen this happen with many people over the years. You'll be a much better steward of the resources God has entrusted to you when you tithe, because it forces a kind of discipline, a kind of fiscal discipline upon you that's really good for you. And plus, and I remember Doug Wilson saying this, the tithe does bring with it God's blessing. Now, we don't know what that blessing is always going to look like, but you said in Proverbs, you said in Malachi 3, the tithe is connected with blessing.
Mhm.
And better to have 90% of your stuff with God's blessing than 100% without his blessing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting too. I mean, when David was offered all sorts of things to bring before God to sacrifice, David refused to come to worship with nothing or with something that cost him nothing. In First Samuel 24, he says, "I'll not come before the Lord with that which costs me nothing." So the tithe does cost. By the way, it's not like I heard lots of times when I was growing up. You'll never miss it. You give 10%, you'll never miss it. God's going to replace it, all this kind of thing. Well, the fact is, no, it does cost you. Sometimes you realize the bills are coming due, you realize a lot of things, and you still,
It is a sacrifice.
it is a sacrifice. And so it's going to cost you. But so when we're coming before the Lord, one of the things we come before the Lord for in worship is to be inspected by Him, to have our works inspected by Him. Uh, what have we done all week long? What have we done for the month? What have we done? And when we bring our offering, when we bring our tithe, that is the point of inspection. That is where God says, okay, I'm looking at what you've done. You've been productive for the week. Good job. Well done. Good and faithful servant. And so he inspects us. You bring nothing. He's like, what have you been doing with your time this week? Why haven't you been fruitful? Why haven't you done these things? Now, again, there are times when financially we don't have the ability to do certain things and we are really in a bad situation. But ordinarily, I remember one friend that Rich and I both have, Wes Baker, down in Peru. They minister in third world situations. And Wes would encourage people. He said, if you only have 1 grain of rice to bring, you bring it. And for them, that could be a lot. You bring these things because God wants to know what you've been doing with your time this week. I know He knows all things, but He inspects what you've been doing. He inspects your work, and He receives those works in Christ Jesus, and He's pleased with them. And then He gives those things back to us in bread and wine, of course. But it's an inspection of our dominion. Your tithe is the fruit of your dominion. It's the increase. Now, I want to ask you a question, Rich, and I know this is a question I get a lot, and you probably do too. Do you tithe off the gross or do you tithe off the net when we're talking about in an American society?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, especially because we have this, I think, diabolical practice of withholding, having taxes
Exactly.
withheld, so you never really see it. But I think the tithe is off the first fruits. I think we should pay God first. So that's the approach I would take.
Yeah, that's one of the big questions, and there are lots of other things that you take into consideration. But yes, it is what you earn. So But as I've heard in the past, seek to give an honest tithe. God's never going to be upset if you gave more than you were supposed to, by the way. So that's not a problem. So,
Well,
uh,
Greg Monson actually argued the opposite, and he did point out some problems that if the money never actually comes to you, was it ever really yours?
right,
You could argue that both ways. If somebody, steals from you before you get your money back home,
right.
do you tithe off what got stolen? There's a lot of questions there you can raise. So I wouldn't be real hardcore about that. But I think there is an emphasis on the first fruits. That's how Proverbs 3 puts it. So
You know, and
that's
I
like it's
and
a
I
normal
and I
circumstance.
agree with you because taxes. I know we could get into a huge discussion about this, but government is authorized by God to receive taxes, tribute. And so even in the withholding and all that stuff that they are doing, even though that I think they're going above and beyond what they should be doing, they are still authorized to do that. And we've earned it. And yes, they do take a lot more than they probably should. But so when we're talking about gross or net, um, you gotta work. You do have to work those things out. But again, I think the better position is that it is the first fruits, as you were talking about, and what we've actually earned. So
Well, this will complicate the discussion a little bit, and then we can start to wrap this up. But one
yeah,
thing you could argue based on 1 Samuel 8, and also just a general theological principle, is that the state should not take more than God. In 1 Samuel 8, when Samuel's warning the people about what will happen if they demand a king like the nations, so basically a pagan king, he's going to take a tenth, and
yeah,
that's considered tyrannical. That's considered a curse. So a government that takes more than that, substantially more than that, in many cases, is that government being tyrannical? And if so, do you consider the rest of what is taken from you in taxation as theft? It can kind of get complicated as you're trying to think through, well, how do I calculate my tithe? But that is one other wrinkle that's there. And I'm actually sympathetic with that argument that the
oh
government
yeah,
should be taking more from us than God. Now, the flip side of that is that in America today, half of our population doesn't pay any income tax at all
right,
because our tax threshold to begin paying taxes is fairly high. And there's so many, obviously, government benefit programs for people and so forth. That kind of complicates the whole situation too. This comes up every time a politician wants to cut taxes, and people say, "Well, this only helps the rich." Well, the reality is they're about
yeah.
the
The
only
only
ones that
ones
really
paying
pay
tax.
taxes. So of course it's going to help the rich if you cut taxes. That's just kind of the system is when the bottom half of the population isn't really paying any tax at all. So those are just things to think about. I don't know that I would have definitive answers to all those questions as far as how to deal with that in a complicated modern economy, but it's
Right.
definitely something that should be thought about. I did
Yeah.
write a paper on this one time where I did try to answer these questions, but it was many years ago. So
Well, and again, going back to what Solomon says, this is the beginning of our wealth. This is where kind of wealth starts. Honor the Lord with your possessions and your first fruits, and then you're going to have full vats of wine, and your barns are going to be filled with grain. So this is extremely important, I think, in a young man's life to understand this. And one of the things that you have to, I think, one of the things about the tithe that you need to understand, one of the things about just giving that you need to understand, is that God doesn't need your money. By the way, He owns all of it.
God's
He
never
doesn't.
short of cash.
Yeah, you're not coming to pay God off or anything like that. One of the God wants you in all that you do. He wants to share life with you, and this is part of that. This is part of that. He wants you to enjoy His gifts. He wants to enjoy what He's given with you, and so you're not paying God off. Um, this honor system that I think Solomon is talking about again is not paying God off. God in Proverbs 3, 9, and 10, as we read, it doesn't speak of silver and gold. Interestingly enough, it speaks of grain and wine, bread and wine. And what God does is when He sees that He can trust you with His stuff because you've obeyed Him in faith, you've given Him, you've honored Him with your possessions. He sees He can trust you, who gives you more. And that's what we do as parents, even with our children. When we see that they can handle responsibility, we say, okay, we'll give you more. This is something we've talked about earlier. God says, okay, you can handle this wealth. This doesn't ensnare you. It doesn't trap you. You're not in bondage to it. You're not loving it to the point where you're making it an idol. You understand it, and you understand that you live in my world, and you understand, and you're honoring me with it. So I'm going to give you more. This is one of the things Jesus prays in John 17 when he says, glorify me that I may glorify you. God, give me more so that I can do more. Give me more so that I can do more. We want to be glorified. We want God to make us weightier, wealthier, so that we can glorify God, so that we can take greater dominion. This honor system is truly a death system. It is giving is death, because one of the things about the accumulation of wealth, one of the things about earning, is that you have poured your life into something. You've poured your time, your energy. Money and possessions aren't just things. They aren't just things. You've poured yourself into them. And when you give your possessions, the things that you poured yourself into, you're giving yourself. And so that separation is a form of death, because separation in that sense is death. And so what God has called us to do is to trust him in death and give and die in his presence, so that he might raise us to make us more prosperous, more glorious. This is the way it is. This is what happens. Jesus talked about it in John chapter 12. Unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, it cannot be fruitful. Unless you're willing to do this. This is how this honor system works, because this is the life of God himself. So you give, and you give yourself, you die in that way, and God raises you to new life, and he glorifies you, he gives you more. And so honor the Lord with your possession. All right. Yeah, Rich, we do need to wrap this up, but do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say, getting at what you're talking about there, a man's property is an extension of himself. You even see that reflected in America's founding documents. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't remember if it was an earlier draft or what. I can't remember all the details now, but it was life, liberty, and property.
Yeah.
Property was seen as an extension of the man. And a threat to his property is a threat to his life. An attack on his property is an attack on his life by extension. So there is a biblical way of looking at property, and I think we need to recover it in our day.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I know Samuel Adams was huge on private property, and fought hard for it. It was a foundation. It was a foundation for our freedom in America, for us to be able to do the things that God's called us to do. And he would be rolling over in his grave if he saw what was going on right now with all that's going on. So, but yes, I mean, thinking about it this way, if you've ever been the victim of theft, I should say, you'll know that you do feel violated. There's something that's almost strange about that. I remember I put my stuff in a gym locker at the YMCA in Louisville, and somebody came in, broke into my locker, stole my debit card, went on a spending spree. They couldn't go too far because I'm not one of those billionaires that the world needs right now. But there's this sense of violation. If somebody breaks into your house, there's this sense of violation, because that property is more than just a thing out there. We've poured ourselves into it. We're connected with it. And when we give to God, it's not just paying him off. It's the giving of ourselves to him. And that is a foundation for us to receive more wealth from him. We need to honor him with our substance. We need to honor him with ourselves, giving of ourselves and all that we do. And when we do that, he will honor us with more in the future, whether in this life or the next. Well, if you don't have anything else, Rich, we'll go ahead and close this out. And until next time, men, get to work and earn some wealth.